Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is one that is very much trending all over socials at the moment, and that was because obviously Netflix did a 10-part series on it, and if you haven't guessed it already, then I'm going to tell you it's Jeffrey Dahmer. This case was suggested to me quite a while ago, and I have looked into it, and I'm pretty certain that everyone knows who Jeffrey Dahmer is. You may not know all of the ins and outs of what he did and who he was as a person, but I mean, surely there's not a lot of people out there that have never heard of him. He's a very infamous serial killer. And if you search up, like, I don't know, the worst serial killers or infamous serial killers, his name will be near the top of the list, along with Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy. All of those are all near the top of it. But I don't know. It's a big case, a very, very big case. So to research it all, and it just takes a very long time. But I've really, really got invested in it. I have watched the Netflix series, and I don't know, I just kept finding myself Googling things like, was that really true? Did that really happen? And I don't know, it just sparked me wanting to actually do it as a case for you guys. And not only that, I can sort of tell you like things in Netflix that maybe I'm not saying that they weren't true, but that they were sort of dramatized a little bit in certain aspects. And when I say that, I do mean a little bit as well, because you know, most of it was very spot on. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on the 21st of May 1960 to mother Joyce Annette and Lionel Herbert Dahmer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Lionel was a chemistry student and he would later become a chemist. And Joyce had quite a lot of problems. She suffered from mental health issues, depression. And it was said that Jeffrey Dahmer, as an infant, was kind of lacking in attention from his parents, I guess you could say. The thing is that obviously his mother was suffering from depression and things like that, which is very difficult. But his father was also away at work, like, all of the time. So that left kind of little Jeffrey on his own to deal with whatever he was, and he didn't get a lot of attention from his parents by all accounts. His mother, it was said, spent a lot of time in bed and had apparently attempted to take her own life on one occasion as well. So obviously that is a very difficult place to be living in. They would argue quite a lot, and you know, he did notice it as well. But one thing I want to mention too is by the time Jeffrey was 4, I'm going to call him Jeff because a lot of people call him Jeff. So by the time Jeff was 4, he went to have a double hernia surgery, and apparently his dad said that he was never the same after that. So whether something happened during that surgery and not enough oxygen got to his brain, or whether, I don't know, that was literally just a turning point in Jeff's life anyway, and it would have happened regardless of the surgery. I don't know, but I just found that really interesting. So, of course, without his parents there all the time, Jeffrey actually turned more to animals. But, like, you know, with serial killers, not in a healthy way. He ended up, at the age of, like, 7, I think he found a squirrel. Like, a dead squirrel. It was on the road. It was roadkill. It was decomposing. And he decided that he wanted to know what was inside it. And he started taking it apart and taking the bones out of it. Now, obviously, that is not a normal child fascination with animals. You know, normally they don't want to take them apart and see what's inside of them. In 1968, the family moved to Bath Township, Summit County in Ohio. It was their 3rd address in 2 years. And they had quite a lot of land, so there was lots of insects around. There was, like, obviously dead animals on the land and things, and Jeffrey would collect these up, and some of them he would preserve in jars of formaldehyde, and he would store them away in this hut. So he just had this massive fascination about dead things. By the time Jeffrey was in his teens, sort of 14-ish, he actually ended up sharing this moment with another lad where they ended up kissing, and this is when he realised that he was attracted to boys. Something which he would hide from his family. And bearing in mind, this is like the 70s, so obviously it wasn't as welcomed back then, I guess. He also had sort of sexual urges towards, obviously, boys and these dead animals too, and so he would go out and he would find them and he would take them apart and look what's inside of them. In high school, it was when people started to think that he was very odd. Like, he began drinking as well. In junior year, he began drinking. People do believe that it was like a way to control the urges that he had and to try and dull it. But he was literally turning up to school, like, drunk in the mornings. And obviously he stunk of booze. And that's not a really good look for a kid of that age. As he was going more into, like I said, into the high school, people, you know, he was thought as an intelligent boy, a nice little boy. People didn't think much of him. He was quite a loner, quite solitary. And then some people started to, he was also known as a trickster as well, I think. And some people started to dare him to jump into these high school pictures, like, you know, like a yearbook photo. And they had these like societies, these groups, and all of those people involved in that group got a picture in the yearbook. So they dared Dahmer to go in all of these. And Jeff did so. And actually one of them was printed. He was caught in the picture too late, kind of thing. Like, they took the picture, they'd done it all, and then when they come in to put it in the yearbook, they realised that Jeff Dahmer was in it, and he wasn't really supposed to be, because he wasn't part of the National Honor Society group, as it was at the time. And so the person who was publishing it just decided to black out his face. And people have said that that's, like, very poignant in his, like, school and childhood years. He would hang out with a few people, you know, like friends from school. And there was some incidents there as well that they really thought was very strange. Like, on one time they're near this stream and he just pulls a fish out of the stream, right? And he just starts gutting it and chopping it up. And one of his friends is like, "What the hell did you do that for?" And he says, "I just wanted to see what it looked like." He just kind of fell in love with dead animals and the idea of death and things like that. And it was just so interesting to him. One time, him and his family were having like a chicken dinner, and he questioned his dad what would happen with the bones if they were put in bleach. And his dad just thought that he had a healthy fascination in science, and he was really proud of that because he was a scienceman himself, being a chemist. And so he really wanted to promote that in his son, which he did. He did promote that. And his father actually showed him how to safely bleach and preserve, like, bones, because he figured it was like this fascination in it that not an unhealthy one, basically. Obviously taxidermy exists. He just figured that he was interested in all that, and maybe he would do something with that in his future as like a career. And, you know, Jeff would do a lot of stuff with animals. Like, on one occasion, one friend said that he found him having a dog carcass, like, nailed to something, and he said that he happened to come across it and it was all a prank. Just really, really strange stuff that, like, you wouldn't normally think kids would do. It didn't take it long to turn into, like, more towards his sexual fantasies toward people, because he began fantasizing about them, about asserting dominance and control from quite a young age. And then eventually those fantasies would get much, much worse. So he actually stated in one of his interviews, because my God, there was lots of interviews done with Jeffrey Dahmer. He stated in one of his interviews that he actually fell in love with, he saw a picture of somebody in the paper, somebody who sadly passed away due to a motorbicycle accident, and he instantly fell in love with him, so much so that he went to his funeral, and basically he got satisfaction from that to the point where he had to excuse himself and go and relieve himself in a bathroom. That's just how, I don't know, I can't even explain it, like how he felt about death, and I don't know. Obviously, it's very strange. He also had this fantasy about this jogger that he kept on seeing jogging by. He literally wanted to take him home with him. And I'm not even joking, on one occasion, he goes out to the side of the road and he hides in these bushes with a bat, planning on hitting this guy over the head with the bat. And luckily, he didn't go past him that day. Thank goodness, because he probably would have done it. And in school, he was seen as the class clown. He would fake things like seizures and things like that and do impressions, and people thought that he was funny. Like I said, he was known as a prankster as well. And the phrase doing a Dahmer was donned from that. Like, they used to say that around school all the time. By 1977, his grades had really gone downhill, and his parents actually tried to get a private tutoring for him, but that didn't really work. And this is when his family started to crumble as well, because that same year they went to counsel him. They wanted to try and keep it together, but that didn't work, sadly. And I believe Joyce found out that maybe Lionel had an affair or something. And so they decided that they were going to have a divorce. They were going to split up. Lionel then left the house in 1978, moving temporarily into like a hotel, which left Jeff and his younger brother David, who I've yet to mention yet. He had a younger brother who Jeff was actually allowed to name. And he chose the name David. But that left both of them, all three of them, in the house together. And then his mother left him too. She took David and she left. So that left Jeff in the house alone, I believe, for around about 3 months. I mean, Jeff was 18 at the time, so technically he was a man. But still, his parents didn't see the help that he needed. Like, all of these things that he was doing was really not right, and nobody seemed to notice. Nobody seemed to pay him any attention. And it's just, I find that really sad. I'm not trying to condone what he did in any way whatsoever, because what Jeff did is beyond unbelievably wrong. But it does kind of make me sad, like how he grew up as well at the same time, and like how his dad absolutely adored him but just didn't spend that time with him, and the only time that he did spend with him was working on dead animals and taxidermy, because he thought he had a healthy interest in that, but it just wasn't. It wasn't a healthy interest at all. And this is when his fantasies really started to take hold, because he was living at home alone. There was nobody there to do anything, to curb anything. And he was having these fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker. We had these fantasies, and then he actually came across one, which is obviously heartbreaking for Stephen Hicks, who was 18 years old. He was trying to hitchhike his way to get to this concert. And so Jeff, who has been having fantasies about something like this, literally grabbing a hitchhiker and taking him home with him and exerting control over him, you know, seized his opportunity, and he pulled up and he offered to give Stephen a ride, which, heartbreakingly, at the time, hitchhiking was the norm. People did it all the time. It wasn't out of the ordinary. Not that many people would do it nowadays. They still do, but it's not as frequent as it was then, because obviously everyone knows how very dangerous it is nowadays. So he took Stephen back to his house. They got drunk, they had a good time together, and then when it came to Stephen wanting to leave, so I don't know whether it was because he said he'd go to this concert and it didn't seem like he was taking him or what, but Stephen wanted to then leave, and they ended up having this wrestling, sort of a wrestle ensued, because Jeff didn't want him to leave. And so they end up wrestling together, and then Jeff ends up picking up this bell, this weight bell, I don't know what it's called, a barbell. Is it a barbell? I think it might be a barbell. And he smacks him over the head. Now, Jeff has always said that this kill was not intentional. He didn't bring him back with the intent to kill Stephen. But that is what ended up happening. And so he then decided that, utilising his skills that he had gained with animal dissection and stuff like that, that he was going to dismember the body. He put the body in like 5 trash bags, I believe. And he was going to drive out to get rid of them. Now, as he was out, he crossed the yellow line in the middle, the central reservation, and a copper was close by. So the police pull him over. And this is like one of the first instances that he could have been caught but wasn't. And I mean, I can understand why, because he pulls him over, because he's gone over the line. He's like tells him why he's pulled him over, and he's checking inside for anything, and he sees the black bags and he says, you know, what's in there, what are you doing with them? And he's like, I'm just gonna throw them out, it's just rubbish, I'm just trying to get them to the tip. So obviously he believes that. So he sends him on his way. That's the first instance that Jeffrey could have potentially been caught, but wasn't. Something I forgot to mention, I believe when he actually did kill Stephen, he put him in his crawl space first. And I believe he took his skin off. I want to say, I think I'm remembering that right. And just a little bit of a side note, when he was eventually caught and police went down there, my God, did it light up under the lamp thing, because there was just blood everywhere, like everywhere. A way of Jeff Hughes to get rid of bones was to like crunch them up and just throw them around the land, which they would find later on. And I mean, this is the heartbreaking thing, because after he committed that murder, right, he's panicking, thinking that he's going to get caught. So he's checking the papers, he's checking everything to see whether anyone's actually noticed that this poor boy Stephen Hicks has gone missing, and nothing ever came up. And so that made him believe that what he was doing, he'd gotten away with it, he'd gotten away with murder, and so what he was doing was easy, and that he could probably get away with it again, because nobody even noticed that he was gone. And that kind of is the mindset that he would go throughout life thinking. I mean, his next murder wasn't until 9 years later, in 1987, but it wasn't for lack of wanting to do it. He did try and lead a normal life in between that, don't get me wrong, he really did try, but he even admitted itself, it wasn't that he didn't want to do it, it was that the circumstances didn't really allow for him to do it. So like I said, in between he did try to have a normal life as best as he could. He got kicked out of college because of his excessive drinking. He went and did a stint in the army, and he was posted in Germany for a while, but again, he got kicked out of that. Well, I think he got an honourable discharge out of that because of his excessive drinking. And so, having no job, no kind of qualifications or skills from college or anything like that, being kicked out of the army, he went living with his grandma for a while. And whilst he was here, he did try again to live like a normal life. He would go to church with his grandma. She was very religious, she would go all the time, and that's what he tried to do. He tried to find solace in God and thought that God would help him and save him. So he was going to church with his grandma. He didn't kill anyone, which was good for a long time anyway. But things did start to crumble, and he actually puts it down to, on one occasion, he was reading a book in a library, and a young man came past him and threw a note at him that was all crumpled up. This crumpled up note basically said, "Follow me to the bathroom if you want a BJ." And that got his mind racing about all of it again. That really turned on his sexual instincts again. And even though he didn't follow him, he has attributed that to the start of when everything began to fall apart again. He would often argue a lot with his grandma. I believe that he actually, he would begin drinking again. He was done for exposing himself at this fair. His grandmother had told him about it, which he didn't seem interested in, but he went anyway, and it was because they had like a beer tent. He got drunk, he exposed himself at it. He was thinking about his sexual need to control people again, and of course that led to murder. For him, lots and lots of murder. I believe for the indecent exposure though, he was only fined like $50. So he didn't get any time or anything for it. In August of 1986, he was charged with disorderly conduct because he was pleasing himself in front of two boys, which he merely clocked down to urinating in public. Before that, in 85, sorry, I forgot to mention this, he was known in the bathhouses, in the gay bathhouses, where he would take a lot of men back there. But then they would find these men drugged up. So he got a name for himself pretty quickly, and so he was barred from them as well, and this is when he started to use hotels instead. He was seen as normal. It is so strange and bizarre, this case. But that is what everyone thought of Jeffrey. They just thought that he was a normal, nice guy. Then he meets his second victim, which is 9 years after his first, Stephen Tuomi. He was 24 years old and he took him back to a hotel room in the Ambassador. We don't really know what happened between the two. All we do know is that they were very wasted. And then in the morning, Jeff wakes up to find Stephen dead next to him. His body was all bruised, his face was all bruised, his chest looked like someone had been beating down on it, and basically, even though Jeff didn't remember it because he literally was blackout drunk, he figured that he must have killed Stephen. Again, this one was not intentional. He didn't plan on killing him. That's just what had happened by the time he woke up. He blacked out and he didn't remember it. His plan was to drug him, but not to beat him to death. So what he did, he's in a hotel. How on earth is he going to get rid of this body? He decides to go buy a suitcase. He brings that back up. He puts the body in the suitcase and zips it up. He's wheeling it out. And he literally gets help from a bellboy to get it out. And not only does he get help from a bellboy, he gets help from a taxi man as well, who puts it in the boot for him. And the taxi man literally says to him, "Wow, this is heavy. What have you got in it? A body?" And Jeff goes, "Yeah, a body." And then they both laugh about it. And so he went then to his grandmother's house where he put the suitcase in the basement. He left it there a week and then he dismembered the body. He put most of the body in trash bags and threw them away, except for the head, which he did some gross things like boiled it and stuff, and eventually when it was like a brittle skull he pulverized that too and spread it out. I also did read, which is in the Netflix adaptation as well, but not, it's slightly different, it's slightly more dramatized in a sense, but the thing about, he actually took a dismembered head and he put it in like this wooden box, which he stored in his locker at work for a while, I believe. But he had this head in this box, and his dad was like inches away from finding what was in the box. There was also a severed penis in there. But he basically convinced his dad that all that was in the box was Playboy magazines, and his dad believed him. This is the thing throughout the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, like, he always had an excuse for everything, and people just believed him because he was such a nice, normal guy. And obviously you're going to want to believe your son. You're not going to think that he's got a severed head and a penis in there, right? Never in a million years. So he believed him. He just thought that it was Playboy magazines, and that was left at that. But he literally came within like inches of finding that in that box. In October of 1987, he found his next victim. This was 14-year-old James Dr. He lured him to the basement of his grandma's house, promising $50 in exchange for posing for nude photos. He drugged him, and then he strangled him. He disposed of his body in a very similar way to Stephen Tuomi. March of 1998 is his next victim. At this point, he was frequent in gay bars, and so this is where he met him, Richard Guerrero. Jeff offered him €50 to go back to his grandma's house and spend the night with him. And of course, people think you live with your grandma. What's the harm? Nothing's going to happen to me for a guy that lives with his grandma. Well, at least that's what I thought anyway. It might have put people's mind at more ease because of that. Well, how wrong they were, sadly. Well, how wrong I was. He drugged him with sleeping pills and then strangled him before performing sexual acts on the dead body. This time, he didn't even wait a day before dismembering the body, but at this point, it was getting harder and harder to hide what he was doing because obviously things were starting to stink. Grandma's wondering what's going on. He was losing his temper a lot with her, getting angry with her. He stopped going to church altogether with her, which he did used to do. He said that he didn't believe in God anymore. Everything was just kind of falling apart. And so he decided that he was going to get his own place, which was Oxford Apartments, flat 213, which is a very famous flat indeed. His grandmother got really mad that he kept bringing men back to the house all the time, you know, obviously with the foul smells and everything. She basically told him to move out, and probably the best idea anyway, because he could then, well, not the best idea for anyone but him, I guess. He could just do what he wanted in his own house. So within days of getting his flat, basically, he ends up luring back a 13-year-old back to his apartment where he repeated the process. He drugged him. But he tried to have his way with the boy, but luckily he managed to escape and he alerted the police. He only spent a week in jail before he was released. In March of 1989, he meets his next victim. And this was just 2 months after being convicted of the charge against the boy. I believe he said to the judge, he'll never do it again, and this, that, and the other, and that is what allowed him to get out. He met Anthony Sears at a gay bar. He was 24 years old. And he decided that he was going to lure him back to his grandmother's house because he felt like his apartment may have been being watched under police surveillance. So that is what he did. He brought him back to the grandmother's, drugged him and took him to the basement, drugged him and then strangled him. And this was to be the first victim that he actually took trophies for. He ended up preserving his head and genitals and he put that in the wooden box, which I talked to you about earlier, that his father nearly found. That was who was actually inside of it. So whilst Jeff was actually in jail, he got onto a scheme where they would let him go out to work release. And at the time he was working at an Ambrosia chocolate factory, so he would go out, he would go to work mixing the chocolate, and then he would have to come back. And this is actually when he killed Anthony Sears. That is the only reason that he met the man and was able to take his life, because it was only 2 months into his sentence that he actually met him, which is just crazy. He got 5 years of probation from that as well. They also said that he had to register as a sex offender. He was paroled from jail 2 months early. In May of 1990, he found his next victim, and that was just not long after he was released from jail as well. Raymond Smith was 32 years old. He was a male sex worker and he had been offered $50 for it. He actually drugged him and he strangled him before taking Polaroid pictures of the corpse in all of these different positions. He dismembered his body in the bathroom and he boiled the remains, dissolving a lot of them in a container of acid, apart from his skull, which he kept in a cabinet along with Anthony's skull. When neighbours complained of the smell from the apartment, he told them that the refrigerator was broken, that he was going to get it fixed. Then in 1990, once more, he found his next victim, 27-year-old Edward Smith. He lured Edward back to his apartment where he once more drugged and strangled him. He kept his body in a freezer for several months, but due to the decomposition of keeping him in there, Jeff didn't actually manage to retain any of his body parts, and that was something that he found quite upsetting because he wanted to, and they just kind of degraded in the freezer and his body was never found. Well, not body at that point, remains, I guess I should call them. And when he actually met Edward Smith as well, he actually did get to know him. He would often say that he was an aspiring actor, so he would often tell him that he wanted to give him money to take photos. But Edward, for Eddie, as he was known to everyone else, his friends, it was easy money. He wanted to do that. And so he got to trust Jeff to the point where he would go and have these photos done. And it was a regular thing that they did quite often. That was until Wednesday the 24th of June in 1990, when Eddie left for the final time with Jeff and he was never seen again. Once more in 1990, we meet, Jeff meets Ernest Miller. He was 22 years old and he saw him outside of this bookstore. He tried to lure him back to his apartment. This time he only had 2 sleeping pills. And so instead of drugging him, he actually murdered him by slashing his throat, his carotid artery. And that he only lasted a couple of minutes after that. Once more, he does the normal routine, he dismembers them, but this time he actually keeps sections of the body to eat later. Because Jeff eventually became a cannibal as well. All the while he's doing this, he's, posing them in all these different photos. It's gradually getting worse. What he's doing, he's gradually getting more and more and more and worse. He said that eating his victims was a compulsion to him, this is later on, and that it made him feel like they were a part of him. And he had trained himself as well. So a lot of the time Jeff would, while they were unconscious or drugged up, he would listen to their heartbeat a lot. And the more he did it, the more he came to realise when these people were coming out of their drug-induced coma. And because they started to breathe differently, he knew they were waking up, and that is when he would kill them, essentially. And the thing with him was as well, he was very controlling. He wanted it to be his way. He wanted, the sexual relations that they were having, he wanted it a certain way. And obviously people not always are going to agree with that and not always want that in that way. And so he felt like the choice for him was to kill them, because then they couldn't refuse and they couldn't tell him not to do something because he would just do it anyway. And then he would pose for the pictures, obviously post-mortem, and he would put them in all these different positions. They would take photos of various stages of him dismembering them. And for him, it was just like exerting control over them. Sometimes he would even, like, if he did a kill midweek, and obviously he worked, so if he did a kill midweek, sometimes he would want to spend more time with that body. So he would want to put it in a bath with ice so that he could keep it for the weekend when he was able to spend more time with it. And he even said that he had to shower in cold water because he didn't want to melt the ice on the bodies. And obviously it was spiraling as well with the cannibalism aspects of it. He would take like the arms, pieces of their thighs, their heart, and he would consume them. And towards the end, before Jeffrey was finally caught, like the month before, the only meat that he was actually eating was human meat, which is just so disturbing. Ernest Miller, when he was decapitated, he actually painted and displayed his head in his apartment, and he also ate pieces of him too. He waited 3 weeks before he found his next victim, 22-year-old David Tomer. And later he did say that he came to realise that he wasn't actually attracted to David, but he still drugged him, murdered him, and dismembered him, just like everyone else. But this time he didn't keep any parts of him, and that was the reason, because he wasn't attracted to him. He wasn't lacking in men. Like, Jeff was thought to be quite a good-looking guy, and a nice guy, and so he would frequent these gay bars all of the time, and people would think that he was this nice guy, and so they would go back with him. And he got a lot of sexual relations with many different people. He had a lot of it. He had it all the time. But obviously he didn't kill everyone, thank God, because who knows how much the toll would have been up if he actually did. But he was quite a desirable man, so he wasn't lacking for people to try and lure back to his house either, which is really, really sad. Next, Dahmer met his victim, Curtis Strager, 17 years old. He was just a stranger waiting at a bus stop that had come visiting family or visiting something, I believe. And Jeff managed to lure him back to his house. He drugged him, he strangled him, he began the process again, dismembered, took photos of the process of dismembering, and he also kept trophies. Now we're into April of 1991, and he meets his next victim, 19-year-old Errol Lindsay. This was the man who he began his experiments on. He wasn't getting satisfaction from even killing people anymore. He had to push further, and so, like I said, it's just an ongoing escalation. Who even knows where he would have ended up if he wasn't caught eventually. But he's gone from sort of dead animals, seeing what's inside of them, to accidentally killing two, well, not accidentally, but not intentionally killing two people, dismembering them, to photography, photographing all the dismemberments, then to cannibalism. And now he's decided that none of that satisfies him enough anymore. He's always chasing that high. Like, he can never seem to reach it again. And so he's always trying to think of new ways to do that. So the kills weren't really doing anything for him at the moment. And so he decides that he would rather have, like, the whole intention of it, right, of Jeffrey is that he wanted control over people who potentially didn't want to be controlled, like nobody really does. And so he would kill them. And he'd be able to do what he wanted. But what if he had somebody who was alive but would do anything and everything that he wanted and wouldn't really talk back, wouldn't really do anything? Essentially like a zombie sex slave, I guess. And that is what he wanted to try and create, and this is where he started. So what he did is he drilled into his skull and put acid into his brain. He was trying to get a zombie-like state, as he said it was. And by some crazy miracle, he actually woke up after this. But Jeff drugged him again, and then he ended up strangling him. He later flailed his body, dismembered it, and apparently kept his skin. Yeah. Or at least he wanted to. May of 1991, he meets his next victim, Anthony Hughes, who was 31. He met him at a gay bar. He convinced him to come back to his house with the promise of taking these photographs, and I believe he was an aspiring, wanted to be a model again. And so he knew what to say. Like, he knew how to lure these people back to his house. Anthony Hughes was also deaf, and so he would communicate to people by writing things down. He had, like, can you imagine the troubles he had in life? Initially, like, he was deaf, he was a man of colour, and he was gay. So in then times, you know, obviously it would have been a really, really hard life for him. And then he met Jeff, of all people. It's just absolutely heartbreaking what happened to all of these victims and what will happen to the future victims before he was caught. You know, it's just really, really heartbreaking. How he got away with it for so long as well, it boggles your mind. So anyway, he strangled Anthony, and he just left his body on the floor, and he left it there for like 3 days before dismembering it and making photographs. And during that time, he was luring somebody else in. So Anthony's still there, deceased, on the floor, and he brings in 14-year-old Konorak Simpsonthorn. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce these names properly. I've even looked them up, and I've watched videos on them. I don't know, my brain just doesn't work very well sometimes, so I don't mean any offense to any of these names that I may be pronouncing incorrectly, and probably am. And if you recognize the surname, he actually had lured one of his brothers in at some point as well, but he managed to escape, thankfully. Sadly, Konorak didn't. He was only 14 at the time. He lured him back to his room whilst Anthony's still deceased on the floor, and he decides that he's going to attempt again with creating a living zombie, and so he drills a hole into his skull and like draws up a full syringe of acid and puts it onto like his frontal lobe. So he then leaves the apartment for a short time, and when he comes back, he finds Konorak outside, partially like naked, with 2 girls around him, obviously really worried about him. And he tries to convince them that he's drunk, that he's a friend, and that he can take him back inside, but the girls are like, well, we've already called the police, kind of thing. When the police got there, he managed, like I said, the thing with Jeff is he could have been caught like a few different times, but he always managed to, he had a way with words, I guess. People believed him. And so he would just get away with things. Like where his apartment was as well, he was living in a sort of mainly black community. Don't know whether he did that on purpose or whether it was just what he could afford at the time. But, so he's a white man living in a black community in them times. And so a lot of police officers were more inclined to believe Jeff than they would, say, a black male or female. And so he was always believed, which is so annoying and so frustrating, but that's how it was. That's how it happened. And so although these people are trying to convince, including one of his neighbours at that point, that this guy is a kid. He's not a 19-year-old man, like Jeffrey was trying to claim. But basically, you know, they both escort him back into Jeffrey's apartment, and then they leave. Within seconds of them leaving, Jeff drew up another syringe of acid, injected that into his brain again, and that proved immediately fatal. He instantly died after that. And like I said, it was Konorak's younger brother who he had previously assaulted in 1989. He then went on to dismember both bodies, and he kept the skull of both of them. In June of 1991, he lures in another victim, 20-year-old Matthew Turner. And he met him in Chicago. He persuaded him to come back to Milwaukee for a photo shoot. Once again, he drugged him, strangled him, dismembered him, and kept his head and internal organs in a plastic bag in his freezer. He then put his torso in a 57-gallon drum, which he filled with acid and began disposing of in the acid. Between the 7th and the 9th of July, Jeffrey Dahmer would kill 3 more victims in 91. First of the 3 was 20-year-old Jeremiah Weisenberger. He was on a weekend away at his apartment in Milwaukee, and he didn't actually murder him until the day after they all got there, after he said that he wanted to leave. And like I said, this was a lot of control for Jeff, and he didn't like it when people wanted to leave, which is why he kind of wanted the zombies or the dead bodies, because he felt like everyone would leave him. Like, he couldn't get in a conventional relationship in his eyes because, you know, if you're in a relationship, that person comes back every day or lives together or whatever, but he wanted total control over them, and he wanted them to do exactly what he said. And he said that he couldn't find that person because there's not a lot of them out there, which is true, but this is why he was doing what he was doing. In his eyes, that's the reason. Next was Oliver Lacey. He was 24 years old. He came back to his apartment under the promise of getting money for photos. And this is where he was drugged, and then he put chloroform over him over the course of a day in an attempt to keep him alive but unconscious. He eventually strangled him. had his way with the body. Once more, he was dismembered, his head was put in the fridge, and eventually his skull was put in this shrine that he had. Between the 9th and the 19th of July 1991, he killed 3 more people. 4 days after that murder, he was actually fired from his job. That very same day, I guess I don't know what, he was feeling really angry and upset that he decided that he was going to kill someone else. He lured 25-year-old Joseph Bredoff back to his apartment. He strangled him and the body lay in his bed for the next 2 days. He was just looking for some work in Milwaukee. He was a father of 3 and, he fell prey to, sadly, Jeff. He then decapitated him, his head was put in the freezer and his torso was put in the drum. And it was on the 22nd of July in 1991 that his kill spree would finally come to an end. Bearing in mind, all this time, the people in his apartment complex have been complaining about these disgusting smells coming from his apartment, which he would just blame on the refrigerator and on meat. And even his superintendent had come around before. And it literally nearly knocked him out how disgusting it was. But he just said it was a bad fridge or the tank had gone funny of the fish tank or something. There was always something, a reason behind it. And so, people just accepted that, I guess. His neighbour put in loads of complaints about him. She rang the police on numerous occasions, but nothing was ever done. Jeffrey was also known around the apartment complex to hand food out to people, which is now potentially widely believed that that food could have been people. So one of his neighbours admitted all these years later in an interview that she had actually had some food off Jeff, and she does believe that she potentially ate a person, which is disgusting. And again, it's just another form of control that he had over them. They were all putting complaints in against him, and so he did something like that. Is like, I don't know, it's just gross, but that's what they believed that potentially. I mean, it could have been, it might not have been, but it also very well could have been, considering what he was doing. But on this day, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards was taken back to Jeffrey's apartment with the intent to obviously murder him. He was lured there under the pretense of, again, the same kind of things, photographs to be taken, money to be had, just have some drinks and things like that. The moment he walked in, he could smell this foul odour and was like, this is a bit strange. And he also noted the stacks of, the boxes of acid he had in there as well, and it was just made him uneasy straight away. He immediately tried to put handcuffs on him, but he only managed to get them on one hand. He then pulled out a knife and pulled him towards the bedroom, where he told him that he was going to take some nude photos. And, he was continuously repeating the words that he was his friend and this, that and the other. Obviously, he just wants out of there. He's frightened to death. He thinks that this guy's going to kill him. So he's just trying to say anything to appease him and just, anything to give him an opportunity to get out of there or to survive this. And during one moment where Jeff had a little lapse of concentration, he took that opportunity. He punched him in the face and there was a scramble and he managed to get out of there. He ran away. He ran down the street, handcuffed, and he managed to flag 2 police officers down who basically were only really concerned with getting the handcuff off of him. If they had a way to get that handcuff off of him without going back to Jeff's house, I'm not saying that this is for sure true, but very likely that they probably wouldn't have even gone there in the first place, or maybe it would have given Jeff some time to move things around so that maybe he wouldn't be caught because he's probably thinking the police are on the way. You know what I mean? But they had no way of getting this handcuff off of him, and so they took him back to Jeff's apartment. And I mean, Jeff didn't even have the keys to these handcuffs, because you want to know how he got the handcuffs off? Well, he chopped their hands off and then he pulled them off. So he never needed the keys. So he didn't actually have the keys. I believe that he pretended that they were in the nightstand or something along the lines. And, when one of the officers went in the bedroom, he actually saw this drawer that was partially open with these Polaroid pictures, very worrying Polaroid pictures in. He opens that, looks at them and starts to see dismembered bodies and things like that. And he basically says, grab him, these are for real, and shows him the pictures. And so they do. They hang up. Jeff, I believe, initially tried to escape. But, they grabbed him, they got him on the floor and they handcuffed him. And they quickly called for assistance. They went ahead and opened the fridge, for instance. And the officer that opened the fridge actually noted how immaculately clean the fridge looked. But inside of it was a cardboard box, and inside of that cardboard box was a freshly severed head of a black man. Can you imagine the shock of that? Like, finding somebody's severed head in a fridge must have been horrific. Authorities would discover other things in Jeff's house, of course. Several heads in his kitchen, 2 human hearts in the fridge, 7 skulls in his bedroom, as well as an entire human torso in the freezer. They would reveal preserved sexual organs, 2 entire skeletons, severed hands, and another 3 torsos that were submerged in the vat of acid in his bedroom in the corner. And so, obviously, everything was very horrific. They actually asked Jeffrey Dahmer after his arrest if he was glad that it was all over, and he said no, that he liked his lifestyle and how he was living. When asked if it was possible that he could lead a normal lifestyle again, like a normal one, not a serial killer one, he said that the best place for him was probably prison. Because if he ever got out, he would just go straight back to it. And it was just really frustrating looking back on how many opportunities they had to catch him. Ignored opportunities. Detectives in Ohio did question Jeffrey Dahmer on at least 4 occasions during his 17 murders. Twice they went into his apartment in Milwaukee, and they still didn't learn his secret, and that was according to records and testimony that actually came out at his trial. It showed that he was questioned with connection to a robbery, a sexual assault, drink driving, and his relationship with a dazed and unclothed teenager. I've already mentioned when he was first contacted by the police. That was in 78, literally taking out the body in Stephen Hicks's body in trash bags. He was done for drunk driving then, but you know, he just got out of it every time. He was linked with a missing persons report. There was a complaint about foul odors coming from his apartment. And you'd think that with that and the missing person link, you know, maybe they'd do something about it. But on both occasions, officers actually went to incorrect addresses, which is absolutely crazy. There was another case where police never followed up on a teenager's report that Jeffrey Dahmer had hit him in the head with a mallet. Honestly, it was so bad. 2 police officers testified that they found nothing unusual about Jeff Dahmer when they questioned him in 1988 about the claims that, you know, he had robbed and drugged someone. One said that he seemed normal. He wasn't hesitant, he felt that there was no problem, and that he believed his story. He told him basically the story was that he met him at a gay nightclub, to have gone back to his home, well, his grandmother's home, where he was living at the time. He said that the 2 had been drinking and fallen asleep, and he told him that he put the man on a buzz a few hours later, and that he had never robbed or drugged the man. And eventually, this case was dropped. He did tell police, though, this was while he was living with his grandma too, which was depicted in the Netflix series. He told police, though, after his arrest that he had drugged and robbed the man and would have actually killed him if his grandmother had not seen him. And not long after that, he actually killed his 3rd victim at home, just days later. Later on, during interviews, Jeffrey Dahmer also told the police that there was a search warrant done on his apartment after a murder in 1988. They found nude photos in his drawer, but they missed the human skull. He was sat in jail for 6 days waiting for the police to come back and basically confront him that they'd found a skull, but they never did. He also told investigators about 2 other close calls when police found a skull in his closet that he had painted, but they thought it was fake. He was also questioned later on about a murder in the building, and that was all while he had a dead body in his bedroom. Honestly, absolutely insane how they just didn't catch him, especially after all those times. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Even the next door neighbour, she was really worried about, obviously, Conorak, who was, the police were convinced that he was a man, but he wasn't, just because Jeff said he was. So she even rang up the police and said, "Are you sure he's not a boy? Is he?" They was like, "No, he's a man." And they're like, "No, he looks like a boy to me, like a kid." And they're like, "Nope, definitely a man. It's all been resolved, miss." And she was proper worried about it, and she rang up about it. And they still dismissed her. And she really did believe that he was not as old as Jeff was claiming that he was, but the police just didn't take any notice of it. However, after prison, he was paroled, and he was supposed to be seeing like a parole officer, which never happened. He was also supposed to go to therapy every month, which he did do, but, you know, He could have just killed someone 2 days before, and then he'd go and sit down on a couch and act normal. That's just how he was. Everyone that met him just thought he was normal, and it's just, that's even more frightening. So as soon as Jeffrey was caught, they began interviewing him. He waived his right to an attorney. He knew it was all over for him, and they did a 60-hour interview with him. Like a 60-hour taped confession. And then when it came to his trial, it came, obviously, there was a question. There was no question that he didn't do it, because he admitted to it all, and there was evidence, a stack of evidence against him. But it was the question as to whether he was insane or not. Now, according to, like, Milwaukee, the question of someone's sanity is that if they know something is wrong and are very aware that they shouldn't be doing it and it is wrong, but they do it anyway, they are classed as sane. So basically, throughout the entire trial, Jeffrey was deemed as guilty, 15 counts of guilt, and 15 counts of sane, which a lot of people have said is even more frightening, because how can a man who is sane of mind do this to all of these people? And whilst the verdict was read, he just sat there, not conscious in the world, not a care in the world. And he got 16 consecutive life terms, which basically meant that he would serve over 900 years in jail, instead of going to like a mental institute if he was deemed insane. So whilst Jeff was in jail, his dad would go and visit him. Like I said, his dad absolutely loved him. His dad was devastated to find out what he was doing. He'd come to him numerous occasions on all these different weird things that were happening, but he just taught them away like he did with everyone else. And so he had no idea, which is so heartbreaking to find out that your son is like that. But whilst he was in prison, he found God. He would get a lot of fan mail as well, which there's so many fanboys and girls out there for him still to this day. People think that he's really good looking and are obsessed with him, and he would get fan mail. He would be sent money from that and things like that. Eventually his victim's family would sue him for that and get the money that he earned whilst in jail and his fan mail and things. His father also wrote a book whilst he was in jail, which I believe the family sued for that as well, and they were going to get any proceeds from any profits he made from that. But yeah, whilst he was in jail, he found God, he worked away, and he actually wanted to get baptized, which he was. He was baptized by Minister Roy Radcliffe, and Jeff was so pleased about that because he felt like, I don't know, he could wash all of his sins away, and that if he didn't think that the Baptist would allow it and that he would say yes, but he believed that everyone can be absolved of their sins, that Jesus, obviously Jesus Christ and God is forgiving, and so he said of course he will. He was thankful that to have this person in his life and that he had not given up on him as well. And then in November of 1993, bearing in mind he was put in jail in 91, he was killed in prison by a man who was a delusional schizophrenic, also a murderer, called Christopher Garver. Christopher Garver killed 2 people that day. He killed Jeffrey Dahmer, who he actually killed him with the same instrument, coincidentally, that he used to kill his very first victim, the bell weight thing, and he hit him over the head with it. Jeffrey showed no signs of defense wounds whatsoever. Don't know whether he saw him coming and had accepted that he was just gonna die or what. He'd accepted his fate. I have no idea, but he had no defensive wounds on him. However, just the first hit was to the head, and he just was so dazed that he couldn't defend himself. I have no clue. But he also killed another man who was called Jesse Anderson. So once he killed Jeff, he went over to Jesse Anderson and killed him. But he did have defensive wounds on him, so he fought back, but sadly he died too. It was said that Jeff actually asked to go into general population, and that he knew that if he was going to go in there, he probably would end up dead, like somebody would kill him. And so that was the end of Jeffrey Dahmer, and like I said, he's one of the most infamous serial killers. He is idolized by a lot of people, which, serial killers, really? Surely there's people out there that are, like, way better than that. I mean, he's not even People say he's really good looking as well. I don't see it personally. I don't see Ted Bundy as good looking either. And especially now that this Netflix has made this series with, I can't remember what the actor's called. Is he called Peter? Whatever, I don't know what it's called. You guys probably do. But with him, that people who romanticize Jeffrey again and fantasize again about him, but he was, don't get me wrong, I understand and I feel bad for how he started out in life and how, you know, his parents weren't there, and maybe he could have been saved. If someone was there and saw the signs and gave him the attention that he needed, just very possibly he may have been put on a different path and lived a completely different life. But he didn't. Turned into a monster, and he killed so many people in horrific and gruesome ways. 17. He killed 17 people and he got away with it for such a long time. It's crazy. And obviously the victims' families who just, their loved ones just went missing one day and they never knew what happened to them until it was on the news that Jeffrey Dahmer the police came around and told them that Jeffrey Dahmer had killed them. It is absolutely heartbreaking. He tore holes in so many people's lives. I also believe as well that his stuff went on sale, and one gentleman bought it all for like $400,000 because he didn't want anybody to get Jeff. Like I said, people have idolized him. That stuff would probably be going for a lot of money now, so they didn't want them to get that. He literally buried it and said no one will ever find it, and then gave some of the proceeds to the family. The Oxford Place buildings, apartments, was knocked down, like a lot of these places in America. And to this day, it still has nothing done with it. It's just a vacant lot, despite people saying that it should be like a memorandum in memorial to his victims. But yeah, a lot of people feel very different about Jeff. They either, even if people idolize him, I don't know. I don't get it, to be honest. Like, people felt very torn about his death. Obviously, a lot of the victims of these families, victims and things like that, were glad that he was gone. Other people were quite sad because they'd got to know Jeff as a person, because he wasn't just the monster. There was also a person inside of that monster, and they got to know the human, the person side of him. And so they felt sad because of that and very conflicted. And I don't know how I feel about it personally. Like, he only served 2 years, which is kind of annoying because in prison he wasn't able to get out his satisfactions and do his fantasies. He wasn't able to, like, be an alcoholic like he was outside and do exactly what he wanted. So that is him suffering, right? But if he's been killed, then that's it. He's just gone and that's that. There's no suffering, there's no nothing. So all them people that he killed, did he ever really suffer for them? Which is what prison's about. Like, you go to jail because you've done wrong and that's your sentence, you serve it out. It's not about being murdered in jail. And so, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. I would have preferred that he would have still been rotten in jail, to be quite honest. Yeah, well, that's not how it happened, I guess. I'd love to know your opinions on it, and what you guys think, and obviously, I've probably missed out some information. This case is huge. I have been sat here for I don't even know how long. My butt is aching. It's been that long. I apologise if I've missed anything out. If I've missed any vital information out, please do put it in the comments and let me know, because, like I said, I'm only one person. I've been doing this case for flaming ages as well. And so, yeah, I've probably missed out a ton. But that's it. That's the Jeffrey Dahmer case. If you've enjoyed this video, give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for similar content. And that is all I have today on the notorious serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.